Hey, Dan.
Yeah, hi, Maury.
You need anything from me? We're ready to go on our end. Roger and Ron are going to be joining me in making the presentation.
Uh-huh, great. No, when the time comes, I'll make you, in fact, I could make you a co-host right now, so it's more seamless, and then you can just pull up your slides and present them.
I've got them
So,
up. If you'd like me to forward you a copy as a backup, I'm happy to do it.
why don't you, yeah, please go ahead and do that, and then I'll integrate them with the deck, and I'll probably upload the deck for the all four workshops up to the into e-filings. So you're now a co-host. You should be able to share your slides. Do you
Okay.
want to test that or
Yeah, here, just a second. Let me hit send on this email.
all right?
How's that?
Yep, I'm seeing it.
All right.
I'm
Cool.
seeing your screen, not the it's in
Yeah.
edit
Yeah.
mode. That's fine. There you go. Perfect.
Okay. I will stop sharing and back to you.
All right, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Hello, folks. This is Dan Greenberg. I'm a advisor with the Colorado PUC. See, we have 22 participants currently. Just going to wait maybe one more minute for other folks to join before we start today's workshop. So please be patient. Thank you. All right, I think why don't we move forward now? Again, Dan Greenberg. I'm an advisor with the Colorado Public Utility Commission. For those of you who I haven't met or we haven't seen each other previously in previous workshops. Let me just share my presentation. There we go. All right. Thanks everyone for being here. Really appreciate your participation in this workshop and all the participation in prior workshops and the comments that folks have sent in. Today, we're going to focus on the evolving role of the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority, and we'll also consider a small number of additional questions about transmission planning from a statewide perspective. So again, this workshop, I'm leading this workshop, it's not the commissioners. So your comments today will help me do a better job of helping the commissioners as they prepare for rulemaking, which is coming up towards the end of this year or late or early next year. And we're just a note that we should avoid discussing ongoing adjudications or at least taking any positions on them. If it's just information, I don't think there's a problem with that. But we're not going to get into any litigating of issues that are ongoing in other proceedings. This slide, if you've been in other previous workshops, you'll know this slide is here just to point out that we're very early in the process. This is pre-rulemaking. There will be many opportunities for additional comment as the official rulemaking begins and proceeds to its conclusion, probably, I don't know, maybe next summer or something like that. So lots of opportunities to share your thoughts in the future. This to give you an idea of who's here. We have our jurisdictional utilities as well as others from the state government. In addition to myself, we have folks from obviously the Colorado Transmission Authority, the Energy Office, and the Office of the Consumer Advocate. We also have a number of stakeholders that are participating today: environmental, large commercial consumer advocates, technology vendors and associations, independent power producers and their associations, and some interested individuals, and some independent grid policy and technology consultants. Okay, so if you've been to these workshops before, you know how this works. If you'd like to make a comment, please raise your hand using the raise hand feature that you'll find in the toolbar. If you've joined by phone, you can dial *9. I will call on you. Mostly, I'm just gonna call on folks in order. Occasionally, I may deviate from that, the order in which you raised your hand, depending on kind of the needs of the situation, I think. Yeah, it'd be great if you could put your affiliation in your Zoom name. If it's not already, you can do that by hovering over your image, clicking on the 3 dots, and you'll see a rename choice there. And again, when you speak, please start with your name and affiliation. I think we don't have to worry about this too much. I think we have plenty of time for today's session, but please please be concise. Don't repeat yourself at length or others at length. And please be collaborative and treat others with respect. As with all the other workshops, we're inviting comments, and there's a link here. If you haven't already received a copy of my slides, you're welcome to send me an email. I'll get them to you. But you can see here there's a link to our e-filings platform in case you haven't used it before, and that will help you to upload any comments on the things we discussed today or in the other workshops. All right, here we are, objectives and agenda. Today, we're going to try to develop a common understanding of the role that the Colorado Electric Transmission Authority, or CETA, will play in transmission planning in Colorado. We'll also discuss, as I mentioned earlier, any rule changes that may be necessary to facilitate CETA's role. We'll talk about a proposal to formalize a collaboration between CETA and the PUC, and how transmission planning will evolve as utilities join regional markets, and how best to facilitate development of advantageous links to regional and interregional transmission lines. Before I hand the mic over to CETA's Executive Director, Maury Galbraith, I thought I'd set the stage by presenting a few of the key authorities that the legislature granted to CETA. And these are enacted in 40-42-104, sub 1 of Colorado revised statutes. First, establish transmission corridors within Colorado. Coordinate, investigate, plan, prioritize, and negotiate to establish interstate transmission corridors. Select a transmission operator to finance, plan, acquire, operate, and maintain transmission facilities. Assess efficient use of existing rights of way as a precondition to pioneering new rights of way. And assess how advanced transmission technologies and storage can increase transmission efficiency and relieve constraints. And just to note there that the utilities will retain their first right of refusal for any transmission assets that CETA seeks to build. So that's the broad outlines of what CETA's charges. But what do these authorities mean on a day-to-day basis? What are the limits to what CETA can and cannot take on? And how does CETA plan to fulfill this mandate? We thought it would be helpful to provide CETA with a forum to level set and to get into the weeds with this group. So with that, I'd like to invite Maury Galbraith to do exactly that. So Maury, you have the mic, and I will stop sharing and allow you to share your slides.
So thank you, Dan. I'm hoping that you're seeing my slide deck.
Yes, we are.
All right. Let me make it full screen here. So thank you, Dan. It's good to be here. Joining me today on this call, I have several CETA board members. I've got Roger Freeman and Ron Lair, who are both CETA board members and both participate on CETA's Transmission Planning Committee. And we also have James Lester, who is a board member and works on CETA's Partnership Development Committee. I think Roger and Ron will chime in frequently as we go through this presentation. So we've put together some slides to help orient folks to the role that we see for CETA in transmission planning in the state. The outline for today's presentation is we want to review some of the authorities granted to CETA in the CETA Act, and so we're going to touch on several of those to begin with. Then we've been attending all of the workshops in this PUC proceeding, and we've been taking notes and trying to capture all the different proposed roles that CETA could play in transmission planning in the state. And so we'll summarize what we've heard. Maybe we haven't captured all of them, but we've captured quite a few. And then we'll sort of give our reaction to whether or not that's a good fit for CETA going forward or not, give you our thoughts on some of those roles, and then we'll wrap up with some quick conclusions going forward. So as I said, we wanted to start with some sort of a recap of the CETA Act, and I think it's important for everybody to understand some key features of CETA. So first of all, CETA is a political subdivision of the state. It is not an agency of the state government, and is not subject to administrative direction by any department, commission, board, or agency of the state. All of the authorities granted to CETA are vested in its independent board of directors. There's an important provision in the CETA Act that says nothing in Section 42 waives or supersedes the application of Section 40-5-101 sub 3, which is local government zoning rules, to a proposed project or to a project proposed or developed by CETA. Importantly, the formulation of that authority seems to imply that other subsections of 40-5-101, specifically the need to go to the PUC for a certificate of public need or of public convenience and necessity, are waived or superseded for a project proposed or developed by CETA. This has come up recently in other meetings and other contexts, but it seems to suggest that CETA does not need to seek a certificate of public convenience and necessity from the PUC. So we wanted to start there. Let me pause and remember that I've got several other people that are participating in this presentation. Roger, Ron, anything to add in terms of CETA being an independent body?
No comment from me. Maury, go for it.
All right.
No, I'm good. Thanks, Maury.
All right. We're going to then go to some of the authorities related to project financing. CETA has the authority to issue and sell electric transmission bonds for the purpose of entering into a project when it determines that a project is needed. The Act defines a project as an undertaking by CETA to finance, to plan, acquire, maintain, and operate eligible facilities located partly or entirely within Colorado. And importantly, finance is also defined, and it means the lending of bond proceeds by CETA to a public utility or a private entity. And we're going to touch on these authorities later when we're discussing some of the potential roles of CETA.
Just a quick addition there, by saying located partly or entirely within Colorado. Obviously, that gives us license to look at projects interstate as well as intrastate, and our studies and approach is definitely focused on looking beyond Colorado for connection points, but our primary focus is the state of Colorado, if that's fair.
Excellent. Thank you, Roger. And then finally, one remaining part of the CETA Act. I think Dan sort of covered these in his slide deck, but we'll repeat them quickly here. Related to transmission planning, CETA has the power to engage in transmission planning activities that would increase grid reliability, help Colorado meet its clean energy goals, or aid in economic development. CETA has the power to consider alternatives, including through studies contracted with independent expert analysts to increase the efficient use of the transmission system and relieve constraints on the transmission system. And then finally, the legislature in 2023 directed CETA to study the need for expanded transmission capacity in the state to improve system reliability, support the state's emissions reduction goals, and support the state's forecasted electricity needs, and potentially reduce land impacts. That provision in the CETA Act is set to sunset in September of this year. And I think when we discuss this later in the presentation, you'll hear that we're interested in exploring the possibility of making that a recurring request from the legislature. So that's sort of the summary of some of the important authorities granted to CETA in the CETA Act. As I said earlier, we've been participating in the workshops, taking notes, and trying to get a list of roles that CETA could potentially play to be helpful in transmission planning. So this is the list that we've captured. We've captured that CETA could play the role of state transmission planner. CETA could be a bridge to RTO ISO transmission planning. CETA could be a coordinator of utility transmission planning. CETA could be a verifier of utility transmission plans. CETA could perform the function of an independent transmission monitor. CETA could serve as a host of transmission planning data, data repository. And finally, CETA could be a public lender for transmission projects. So that's the list that we've captured, and what we thought we would do is go through each of those roles, potential roles for CETA, and give you our thoughts and perspectives on whether or not that's something that would be a good fit for CETA. All right, so let's start with CETA as a statewide transmission planner. I assume that most of the people on this call are transmission policy wonks and have been following CETA's development of a statewide transmission study over the course of 2024. And so I'm not going to do a complete recap of the 2024 study that CETA is just about to complete and present to the legislature in January. What I am going to say is that we've gotten really positive feedback from stakeholders on the study, and I think CETA is interested in taking on this role going forward. We specifically asked stakeholders to give us some input on how frequently we could update the transmission study, and we're leaning towards potentially updating the transmission study every 3 years. If you have been tracking the current study, you'll know that there was an initial report that we presented that initial report to the PUC in late August. We will be receiving a final report here in the next week or so. The final report will be considered by the CETA Board of Directors at its December 12th board meeting. And then there's a presentation to the legislative energy committees in January. We think that that this is something that provides value to the state. We think it provides value to the electric utilities, to some of the environmental and consumer advocates that participate in PUC proceedings, and we think it provides value to the PUC. So this is something that CETA is interested in doing on a forward basis, and maybe conducting these studies every 3 years. So with that, I'll let Roger or Ron chime in.
Yeah, this is Ron Lair. It raises the question, Maury, and maybe you've thought about this, the PUC's normal utility planning exercise, as I understand, is on a 4-year basis. So it would be in sync every 12 years. Is it, have you thought about that synchronicity, and you want to add anything on that?
Well, I think we'd be willing to consider different timeframes and how to sync it up better with the PUC process. So there might be others on this call that have some suggestions on how to do that.
If I could, more, I just want to clarify that although the resource planning is on a 4-year, typically on a 4-year cadence, transmission planning by Rule 3627 is every other year, so it's on a 2-year basis. And then utilities present their plans for the subsequent 3 years every year, that by Rule 3206.
And I'd just add that we are acutely aware of the different circles of planning that are occurring in the state and beyond. And part of the exercise here today and going forward is not to duplicate or create circles that overlap too much with what's being done while continuing to fulfill our mission and providing, this additional push towards transmission planning and development that we're charged with.
Right. Thanks, Roger. Thanks, Ron. So, Dan, I was thinking that it might be best if we pause after each of these potential roles and allow others on the call to ask questions and provide comments.
That sounds great to me.
All right. I'll let you be the master of ceremonies and handle the question queue.
All right, sounds good. Let me see if we have any hands up. Yeah, Mr. Milosevic, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Larry Milosevic. I'm an independent advocate for advanced transmission technologies. And really, I wanted to comment about Mr. Greenberg's first slide on CETA's statutory role in transmission planning, and note that it's perfectly aligned with the rule proposed in workshop number 3 about conducting an ATT grid optimization study. Specifically, the last 2 bullets concerning CETA's authority to assess the efficient use of existing rights-of-way and to assess the use of ATT to improve the transmission system. I want to suggest that CETA is really ideally suited to oversee an ATT optimization study, or at a minimum that CETA should be at the table along with staff and the utilities for at least 3 reasons. The first is that CETA has a statewide perspective, and that's the scale of an optimization study that's most needed. Second, that CETA is an independent entity and isn't affected by misaligned financial incentives. And third, that CETA has already demonstrated its competence and success at putting together an effective team to conduct a statewide transmission study. And finally, regarding funding for a CETA-led ATT study, it would be ideal if the legislature would provide the funding, of course, but assuming that's not forthcoming, the study would presumably be funded by ratepayers. And while I have no idea how much such a study would cost, I did think of one data point to consider, and that is that a $2 million study would cost each ratepayer about $1, and even less if Tri-State contributed as well. And that just seems dirt cheap to me for something that could potentially have benefits that would absolutely dwarf the cost of the study. So my hope is that a way can be found for CETA to take a lead role in a statewide ATT grid optimization study. Thanks.
Any response on that, Mr. Galbraith? Or others?
I think CETA would be interested in doing a advanced transmission technology study. We've been approached by several consumer-owned utilities that are interested in exploring transmission options that are considered sort of near term, that can be implemented in the next 3 to 5 years, as opposed to 15 to 20 years in the future. And I think an advanced transmission technology study would be of interest in that regard. And so it's something that I think we would be interested in doing. And of course, funding is the paramount issue for us.
Mr. Lair, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd be interested in knowing from Mr. Milosevic what the scope of the study is that you're suggesting. And I guess my reaction is that in a study like this, the good question is always compared to what. So if you're going to compare advanced transmission technologies to whatever else there is, unadvanced ones or commonplace ones, then you've got a pretty comprehensive transmission study going. And so would this be a separate effort of some kind? Is that what you have in mind?
I'll just step in for Mr. Milosevic. I think probably what he's referring to and what we discussed in the last workshop was a potential study for the existing system, as opposed to, Mr. Lair, if I'm not mistaken, I think you were talking about ATTs in the context of new build for load growth or other purposes. And I think the main focus of that, the concept, at least in my mind, the main focus of the concept would be to identify areas on the existing grid where there could be ratepayer savings by retrofitting advanced technologies to the system.
Well, that's fine. I think I understand that, but I'd still like to hear from Mr. Milosevic what he has in mind.
Yeah, I guess I'm not. I'm the type of study, as Mr. Greenberg said, that was proposed in the last workshop is really looking at the existing system and just making it more efficient. It's been a system that's been put together piecewise over the last century, and it's very inefficient. And the use of the whole gamut. So in partial response to your question, I'm thinking about a study which would look at all types of advanced transmission technologies, the GETs and advanced conductor and energy storage, and even distribution system measures like controllable load that have an impact on transmission system needs, reducing transmission system needs. So an example, a partial example, if you're familiar with the Brattle Group study of the GETs on the SPP transmission system, showed just remarkable benefits that could have paid for the costs in production cost savings alone in a mere 6 months. And that's just the GETs. And so I'm thinking about, we've been talking about a broader view of advanced transmission studies. So while the Brattle Group study is something to think about as a guideline, I'm thinking of even something broader as far as the types of technologies that are considered. And the point would be to make our transmission system more efficient, which will have impact basically on all future transmission planning in the states, very likely eliminating the need for some projects if our system as a whole is more efficient. So I'm thinking of a very broad study, and something, the reason I think CETA would be so good is that CETA did such an excellent job on the transmission study, statewide transmission study that was just completed. And I think just the ability to put together a competent and independent team, this would be a team of ATT experts.
Mr. Milosevic, I think
do that really well.
I think we understand that. I think we could get more into the weeds of that, but I hopefully you've described it well enough for Mr. Lair at this point. I do want to keep things concise because we do have a lot of hands up and a lot to do today. So, Mr. Lair, any response?
Well, it sounds like I'm going to take that response as saying, yes, it's a separate study from the transmission study that we're talking about here.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Satya, please go ahead.
Thank you. Vijay Satyal, WRA, Deputy Director, Regional Markets and Transmission. I have nothing but respect for Larry's consistent and dedicated request for ATTs or GETs to be considered, but the focus here is transmission planning, and the focus is looking at how the state of Colorado could be better connected with its neighboring entities, and or how transmission can be allocated to bring in more energy resources that it needs. From that angle, my request is that if CETA is going to take on such a study, it be a comparison of alternatives of new transmission versus improving existing efficiencies. Maury's an economist. Maury knows this very well. If you start doing just one technology-focused study, you're getting locked into you're getting locked into seeking efficiencies where sometimes it's not really Pareto optimal. Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Hickey, please go ahead.
Thank you. Lisa Torman Hickey, representing the Interwest Energy Alliance. And we have another representative today, Chris Leger, who's on. I wanted to be a little cantankerous. I also have great respect for what Mr. Milosevic is recommending. Those studies can increase efficiencies at a low cost. For example, Tri-State did at least an analogous study a couple of years ago and found amazing increases in its capacity for, maybe $100,000 or less. And that needs to be done. However, I would suggest that we do not want to, as part of our recommendations in this workshop, take burdens off of the utilities, which should be rested on their shoulders to maintain an efficient grid and study it themselves. Now, we can say that we will not do that, but I think effectively you might be doing that if you set up that regular study process. So with that, I would just suggest we keep that in mind as we talk about CETA's role going forward.
Ms. Hickey, if I might ask a follow-up on that, what do you think of Mr. Milosevic's point that CETA is better positioned as an independent entity without profit motive?
I understand that, and that motive potentially would be seen as weakening their desire to do a good job. And we all recognize that CETA is going to do a great job. Yet we can require more. And the fact that we haven't always been able to enforce our policies in the past and the goals of those policies doesn't mean we shouldn't try in the future. And I think we're all getting better at transmission planning and expectations and implementing those plans. And therefore, I think that we need to require some of this prudent infrastructure management from utilities, whether their profit motive is aligned there or not. And I think the commission is best qualified and authorized to enforce those requirements. We don't want to waste CETA's valuable resources is part of my concern.
Got it. Thank you. Ms. Selker and Mr. Neal after her. And I would ask that you please be as brief as you can. Thank you.
Yep, just really quickly want to agree with Mr. Milosevic's point that CETA could certainly do a great study to find valuable GETS deployments to maximize the existing grid, and that looking forward, GETS could be part of a general transmission planning study, as Vijay mentioned, Mr. Satyal mentioned before. And yeah, I think that's it then. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Neal, please go ahead.
I wanted to echo what people say about Larry's recommendation for a ATT study, but point out that one of those technologies is topology optimization, which would model the system and look at inputs at places such as Pawnee and Cheyenne Ridge and Lamar, and see what constraints there are in the system and see what has to be what is needed to eliminate those constraints. And I don't think CETA's done a topology optimization study yet, or the utilities. So I think that's one of the techniques that needs to be done. And then also look at things like reconductoring and power flow control and those kinds of things to look at what's really needed and what can be accomplished without a lot of expensive transmission. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Yeah, back to you, Mr. Galbraith.
Okay, thank you for that input and those comments. That was very informative. Let me go back to my slide here and make sure that I'm doing this right. So the next role that we wanted to tee up is that we've heard several times in previous workshops that CETA could perform the function of being a bridge to RTO ISO transmission planning. And we wanted to respond to that. We think that in the future, Colorado utilities will likely be joining an RTO ISO structure, and most RTOs ISOs have a transmission planning function, but they tend to plan for the entire market footprint, and we think it's likely that footprint will be larger than just simply the state of Colorado. And therefore, we think it's important for CETA to continue to conduct a Colorado transmission study every 3 years, or on a regular basis, to make sure that nothing is falling through the cracks. That by looking at that larger footprint and effectively negotiating with other states and other stakeholders, that Colorado isn't missing, or that the RTO is not missing a Colorado investment that would help Colorado achieve its clean energy goals. So we do not view CETA and its transmission planning activities sort of as a temporary bridge to RTO ISO planning. We view it more as a complement to current utility planning and a complement to future RTO ISO transmission planning. But we're here to learn and would be willing to listen to other alternative views on this. So back to you, Dan, for any comments or inputs from the workshop participants.
Yeah, I think I'm not seeing any hands up right now, and maybe would it be okay if we took these questions at the end as far as the various roles that you could play?
Sure, happy to do that.
Okay.
Let me ask Roger and Ron if they have anything to add on RTO ISO transmission.
I'm not sure if we board members are subject to the raise the hand rule, but just quickly, we are sensitive on budget. Frankly, it's a big issue, and Mari's done amazing work with what we have. But when it comes to planning versus steps that will actually push the envelope on building transmission or otherwise advancing the ball in our overall mission, I think our fingers on the pulse of anything that will help move things forward more quickly, given our budget, and that's really an important barometer that the board considers on every decision.
Yeah, this is Ron, just building on Roger's comments. We have limited staff time and resources available, and it's pretty unclear as to what RTO is going to be in play, or whether the commission will find it in the public interest for Colorado utilities to join. So I think this is one where we can put it on the wait and watch, on the back burner, have it on the stovetop, but on the back burner someplace, and wait and watch and see what happens here.
Okay. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Roger. So the next role we'd like to tee up for consideration is CETA as a coordinator of utility transmission planning. I will note that we think that role is currently being filled by the Colorado Coordinated Planning Group, CCPG. West Connect currently provides a place for the CCPG to do its work. And CETA is interested in continuing its participation in CCPG meetings. So that's sort of to level set. CETA is willing to consider, however, requests for it to provide a place for CCPG to do its work. We think we've heard that from several commenters in previous workshops. And in considering that request, we would probably want to be responsible for the public meeting notification and stakeholder engagement process around CCPG. We want to be responsible for sending out meeting invites, putting out meeting notices, and really making sure that that the group is responsive to stakeholder comments and stakeholder input. And so that's our thinking on playing the role of coordinator of utility transmission planning. I would say this is something we're willing to consider if requested. So Roger, Ron, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, this is Ron. I think coordination is great. I'm all for having coordinated utility transmission planning, but I think I'm much more interested in getting higher quality and more timely transmission planning outcomes in front of decision makers, particularly those who can invest money. So maybe setting higher standards, if that's part of the coordinator work, or bringing best practices to bear, I think that would be more vital role than coordinators. We're pretty well coordinated as far as I can tell. Thanks.
I strongly echo Ron's comments there. On my duplication point earlier, I think this is a good example, one where we want to add value rather than contribute an additional circle. So I'm sensitive to that one as well.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Ron. So the next one is CETA playing the role of verifier of utility transmission plans. Again, I think CETA is willing to consider requests for it to perform this role. Our initial thinking is that CETA could review utility 10-year plans and determine whether or not it could vouch for the reasonableness of those plans. We think that we could probably perform this role in coordination with a statewide transmission planner role, and that we could report on the utility 10-year plans and make some sort of statement on the reasonableness of those plans in our initial and final reports that we produce. We understand that may not be aligned with the needs of the commission and parties that participate in commission proceedings. So we're willing to consider other mechanisms other than our reports through doing transmission plans every 3 years for sort of conducting those reviews and providing those statements of reasonableness. But it seems to be a fairly good fit with the role of statewide transmission planner. For the current plan, we use the utility 10-year plans as sort of the point of departure for the second 10 years in the planning period. So we did review the utility 10-year plans. We just didn't see a need to make adjustments to them, and we didn't seem to see a need to make an explicit statement on the reasonableness of those plans. But we could do that going forward. So again, this is something that we'd be willing to consider if asked to play this role. Roger, Ron, anything to add?
Yeah, this gets closer to the role I'd like to see CETA playing, which is we need to be closer to the state of the art in terms of transmission planning. We need to have higher ambition for our transmission planning and for our transmission investment, and we need to have it be more timely. So if we can add our voice that way, I think that's what I'm interested in. Thanks.
Nothing further from me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Thank you, Roger. Moving on, the next role that we identified was CETA as an independent transmission monitor. This is closely related to maybe that role as a verifier of utility transmission plans, but this one seems to be more aligned with PUC proceedings and less aligned with CETA's periodic every 3-year study. Again, I think we're willing to consider requests to perform this role. We could review transmission-related testimony and provide technical advice to the commission in regulatory proceedings if asked. And CETA could perform this role on an ad hoc basis as requested by the commission, as opposed to incorporating it within that statewide transmission planning function that we discussed earlier. So we're willing to consider this and probably need to hear from people that support this concept if we've got this framed right and we're thinking about it correctly, or if we're missing some key points. But something we would consider. Roger, Ron, anything on the concept of CETA being an independent transmission monitor?
Yeah, just briefly, the exercise of a utility's right of first refusal suggests that there are going to be some criteria that utility take out of a CETA prioritized project would need to meet. So it does need to be some kind of monitoring, and I would think that the PUC would also be interested in monitoring the commitments that the utilities bring through the transmission planning exercise as it exists now.
Okay, thanks, Ron.
And I just add briefly that we're formulating a number of policies relating to many of these roles. Maury's taking the lead in that as part of our build the structure for our organization that we're still involved in. So keep an eye out for those and continue to participate there as well.
All right. Several people in these workshops have suggested that CETA could serve the role as a host of transmission planning data and sort of maintain a repository of data and perform the role of making that data available to other stakeholders, including, other utilities, other planning organizations, and advocates and interested parties. So I think that this fits nicely with a wide transmission planning entity. We would be willing to consider requests to perform this role. Before we took on this role, we'd likely want to also, like I said, perform that statewide transmission planning role. And in addition, we would need to work closely with the Colorado utilities and WEC to ensure that we're adequately protecting critical electric infrastructure information in hosting this data repository. So again, something that we'd be willing to consider. This might, I mean, all of these probably require additional funding, but this one in particular, depending on how robust the data repository needs to be, could require additional funding. Any thoughts there, Ron or Roger?
Not for me, thanks.
Yep. And then finally, one thing that we've heard, maybe not as many times as we've heard some of the other roles, but we've heard it in several instances, is that CETA can perform the role as a public lender for transmission projects. At the beginning of this presentation, when we summarized some of our authorities, we mentioned that we have the ability to loan the proceeds from issuing and selling transmission revenue bonds to the public utilities and other persons to develop transmission projects. And we think that CETA's partial financing of utility transmission facilities can reduce the overall cost of projects for customers. And therefore, we're interested in working with the Commission and Colorado utilities to develop plans for cost-effectively using CETA's revenue bonding authority to help finance projects and reduce the overall cost of projects, and maybe in certain instances help resolve controversies around cost allocation. So this is something that we're interested in, and we'd like to have further discussions with folks at the PUC and the Colorado utilities about how best to use CETA financing. Ron, I think I know you're interested in this. You want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Maury. If I could just take a second to lay out the thinking that I've done so far on this. And that, I've only been working on IRP planning in Colorado since 1983. That was when Rick Fagno was a young lawyer. And one of the things that occurs to me from that perspective is that we don't do financial planning as part of that mix. You don't buy a house without thinking about how you're going to finance it. But we're approving resources for utilities to buy without looking at how to finance them effectively. These are huge capital investments. And the state of the financing really does matter to the outcome in terms of the overall cost of the project, as Maurice's slide points out. So if we're looking forward, Mother Nature's pissed off and she bats last. So we're going to have damage to transmission systems, in my view. And if you believe Warren Buffett, the private investment is going to be tough to get for this kind of stuff. He's reacting to $30 billion worth of liability on PacifiCorp for Oregon wildfires. Now, you remember the Marshall Fire and its impact on the insurance costs and other costs for Xcel Energy. If that future obtains, and we're both having to repair the damage from a lot of different things, not just wildfire, wind, lightning, there's a lot of effects that can obtain here, and we'll have to repair those to keep the system going at the same time that we're investing in the future to solve the climate problem that's causing a lot of the damage. That's going to be tough, and if Warren Buffett's right, the private sector financing is going to be risky, and if it's risky, it's going to cost more. That suggests a role for public financing, and here's CETA with public financing. So I'm just suggesting a case where this function of CETA's roles given us by the legislature could be very, very important going forward. One that I'm going to be arguing within the board that we had to put some priority on and develop the abilities to bring this money to the table. Now, for the purposes of this rulemaking, I haven't seen anything yet that says that the utility will provide a financial comparison between business as usual and this kind of public financing. But that might be something that would be a good idea if you want to reduce the overall cost of transmission projects for consumers. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Roger, anything to add on CETA as a public lender?
Oh, just that I couldn't agree more with Ron. Surprisingly enough, no, of all the things that we might be able to advance the ball on, funding and our unique authority there is crucial to, I think, the board as a whole. And yet we need the resources to develop this. I mentioned that I don't know, Mari, you plan to mention this, but I think it's worth saying that we've put out some requests for particular funding support for some of the policies that we need to develop. So if we're going to move forward in the way we need to and keep building momentum for all these things, particularly those that advance the ball towards actual construction or improvement of transmission, we're going to need to build our group. So without beating that drum too many times on this, please, as a whole, those on the call, look at those requests and consider how we can help build the organization to accomplish the goals we're talking about here.
Thank you, Roger. So Dan, with that, we've got a couple conclusions for you here. CETA is interested in being a statewide transmission planner. We're interested in conducting transmission capacity expansion studies periodically. I think we've suggested in these slides that every 3 years would be a good time frame. If there's a better timeline that syncs up better with the PUC, we'd be interested in working to do planning on that improved timeline. We're also interested in being a public lender for transmission projects. We're interested in having a conversation with the folks at the PUC, Colorado Utilities, about developing plans for using CETA's lending authority to the maximum extent possible and helping to save consumers some costs. And then finally, CETA is willing to consider requests to perform other roles. And so, we haven't ruled out any of the roles that we've covered today or that we've heard proposed in the proceeding. It's just that we are a small startup organization and we're constantly trying to prioritize. And so our priorities would be on statewide transmission planning and as a public lender for transmission projects, but we're willing to consider other requests. So with that, Dan, I'll turn it back to you and you can take it from here. We're happy to answer any questions or take feedback from commenters. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Maury, Ron, and Roger. Very helpful presentation for me, and I'm sure for others. I'm not seeing any hands up, so I have a couple questions I want to ask, but I do want to first emphasize, folks, this is we've gone past the time allotted for this segment, but I think this is a really important opportunity for this group of stakeholders to level set with these representatives from CETA and ask questions. So please don't be shy about raising your hand. So I just have a couple of questions. I wasn't entirely clear on the difference between the potential role as a verifier of utility transmission plans and the role as an independent transmission monitor. So I might ask you, I know you did this earlier, but I might ask you to just clarify that. And in the same response, one of the things I've been wondering about, and I think this would fall under verification, but for the utility electric resource plans, we pretty consistently asked, well, let me just rephrase that. In the clean energy plans, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment came in not as an intervener in those proceedings, but as a verifier of emission reductions from each of the proposed or each of the model portfolios. And I wonder if that's, I mean, I imagine this would fall under CETA as a verifier, but the concept would be analogous to what the role that the CDPHE plan. So when a utility presents its transmission plan, we might ask CETA to review those plans and verify, for instance, that it aligns with the needs that were identified in the most recent needs study. So that's my first question.
So Dan, I think in my way of thinking about it, the verifier of utility transmission plans is a narrower focus than the independent transmission monitor. As a verifier of utility plans, I view it as being asked whether or not the utilities 10-year plans are reasonable, right? Whether or not they fall and have accurate inputs and internal consistency, and the outcomes seem reasonable. And so that's the scope of that work. I think it fits nicely within our desire to do transmission planning studies going forward. We're gonna build those studies on top of the utility plan, so we're already going to be incorporating them into our plan, and it's a fairly easy next step to tell the commission and tell others what we discovered when we were reviewing those plans, and whether or not we think that the outcomes of those plans are cost effective or reasonable, or whatever standard needs to be applied. So it's a narrower focus than the independent transmission monitor. I think the independent transmission monitor could cover not just the utility plans, but could cover issues that come up in other kinds of proceedings at the PUC. So you'll see that the way that I framed it is that as an independent transmission monitor, we would be providing transmission-related advice to the commission, sort of on an ad hoc basis, on a case-by-case basis, so that if a dispute about transmission, arises in a commission proceeding, and the commission doesn't feel as though that the record is addressing the issues or the questions that they have, CETA could play the role of an independent transmission monitor and provide technical advice to the commission on issues as they arise. So and in my mind, that scope is much broader than just focusing on the utility transmission plan. So I hope that helps. I may not have it conceptualized correctly, and so others can correct me if I've got that wrong.
Well, that helps me anyway, and it sounds like that latter role could be providing really consulting assistance to the commission's trial state.
I view independent transmission monitor as sort of the equivalent of a independent subject matter expert that provides advice to the commission on a whole host of transmission related topics. So again, maybe I don't have it conceptualized correctly, but that's the distinction I drew and I sort of heard when people were discussing that role.
Thanks. I mean, that's very helpful. My second question is really on the idea of CETA as a lender for transmission projects. Are you suggesting then that CETA could be the provider of funding for all transmission? I mean, what would be the scope of that role? I mean, it could be, I imagine even CETA might run out of opportunities for funding. So what are your thoughts about how far that would reach?
Great question. So there is no statutory limit on the amount of transmission revenue bonds that CETA can sell. In other words, they haven't capped the amount of transmission bonds that we can sell at $1 million or $10 million, or there's no cap in our authorizing legislation. There probably is a limit to the depth of the market, right? In other words, our ability to sell transmission revenue bonds is probably limited in the marketplace by by the fact that we're a relatively that we're a new organization. We've never issued revenue bonds in the past, so there probably is some sort of limit, but it's a market depth sort of concept. As Roger said, we're interested in getting some funding to help us hire some financial experts and some attorneys with expertise on issuing revenue bonds to come up with a roadmap or a cookbook for how CETA would go about issuing transmission revenue bonds. And we're hoping that those experts can give us some sense to how often we can issue revenue bonds and how much money we can potentially raise to fund transmission development. So I think it's unlikely that, again, we're not here to compete with the incumbent utilities. Our funding is not going to supplant the need for utility financing of projects. That's why we think it would be a good idea for CETA to sit down with the utilities, sit down with the commission, and think about how best to use our financing. Which projects is it more appropriate to use CETA financing on, and which projects is it not appropriate to use CETA financing on. Again, I think we can partially fund projects and lower the overall cost of the project for consumers. So I think it's something that should be considered, and looking forward to having those conversations going forward.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Wilson, please go ahead.
I want to say that I find CETA and all the aspects they just mentioned to be very exciting for the state. I would like to focus back on a role for CETA in transmission planning, specifically 3627, 10 and 20-year plans. In the past, and I have provided comments for several organizations over the years on 3627 plans, ALJs were typically tasked with adjudicating 3627, and I don't think that worked very well. I think it would be much better to have an organization like CETA to fill that kind of role. So as we are looking at, I assume, upgrading the rules for 3627 filing, I think we should consider how to build CETA into a role of monitoring, helping with, I don't want to say adjudicating, but providing wisdom and value added to utility 10 and 20-year transmission plans under the auspices of 3627, unless we come up with some other rule for that kind of effort. But that's kind of where I think I will focus my comments in this first round, is how to build them into that process. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Wilson. And I do think that's something that we're going to be talking about later on this afternoon, as Mr. Pasaccio will be presenting on I think a similar concept. So Mr. Lehr, please go ahead.
Well, thanks. I just wanted to put a little finer point on the question of how much financing CETA might be able to do. The longest journey starts with a single step. The way I read our transmission plan that we put on the table is that a great deal of that is reconductoring the existing system. Reconductoring is expensive. It's more expensive than the standard conductors, but it lasts a long time and it provides a long stream of benefits. Having introduced the idea of securitized bonds to Senator Hansen some years ago, I know that there's a market for utility ratepayer-backed bonds, and that it provides, in the right interest rate circumstances, tremendous potential for savings to consumers. Now, I've heard that the staff of the commission objected to that because it would put costs for retiring the old coal plants, which is what was at stake initially, onto consumers who didn't benefit from the old coal plants production. But here we have investment in transmission, which should benefit the future quite a bit. And we wouldn't want to have those future ratepayers be free riders on the system that exists now and on the ratepayers who are paying the bills today. So perfect example for long-term securitized ratepayer-backed bonds to finance a portion of this. And it seems to me we ought to get some of the reconductoring projects up at the top of our collective priority list and see how the financing from public sources would complement the utility financing to bring down the costs. Now, that would be aided if this rule that we're contemplating has in it a requirement that the utility do some assessment of that. What is the cost with public financing? What is the cost without public financing? Let's see a comparison and see if this works. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Mr. Lair. Mr. Hefner from Tri-State, I see your hand is up.
Good afternoon. Thanks again for having us today. Just a few brief comments on what's being talked about. First of all, just noting that, Tri-State intends to join the SPP market in 2026, which is in the relatively near term, and sees its transmission planning function for that footprint going into SPP, at that time, sort of obviating the need in a lot of regards for a state-specific transmission planning effort. As far as some of the organizational comments as to CCPG, I'm not sure we quite tracked the proposal that the CCPG work would be somehow hosted by CETA. I'm not sure we had the contours of that. But one thing that we thought might be worthwhile to suggest would be CETA could certainly do something like chairing a subcommittee within CCPG, which any stakeholder could do, something like the 20-year planning group or a similar working group, and could sort of leverage the CCPG process in that regard. I think we have some concerns about the notion of CETA as the reviewer of utility transmission plans. First of all, because it feels somewhat duplicative of a role that commission staff and in some regards UCA already plays. And also just sort of thinking through what's the additional expertise that CETA brings over the engineers and experts that already advise the commission, and would CETA be hiring outside consultants essentially to come in and advise the commission? Would it be hiring transmission planners on staff? I think there's some question marks there. And then finally, on the repository idea, on the data repository, we would just note that WEC already fills that function in a pretty robust way as far as we're concerned, and makes transmission planning data broadly available to anyone who can sign an NDA. And so again, I think we're just sort of looking for what's the value add, what's the incremental benefit, and certainly welcome responses to those questions, or just sort of food for thought. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Before I go to Mr. Satya, I'll provide any of the CETA reps an opportunity to respond to those questions or points.
I thought those were all excellent questions, right? I mean, a lot of the roles that I think Tri-State is questioning whether or not CETA is a good fit for are roles that, we indicated, look, we'd be willing to consider, a request to perform that role, but we have questions as well. And so, if there are parties that are interested in having us, host a data repository and those things. There's a lot of details that would need to be worked through, and a lot of those questions that are being raised would have to be addressed. So no pushback, just additional work to be done if we're going to pursue those roles.
One thing I would comment on about what Mr. Hefner stated is that, and I think it's pretty common knowledge that it's pretty difficult to hire folks that have a lot of experience in transmission planning, and you could probably raise that to the power of 10 for a public utility commission. So there's a very, in my view, very significant asymmetry in the information and expertise available to the commission. And so the concept of having an independent third party supporting this commission's staff, I don't think that would be duplicative in the least. I think it could be extremely helpful. That's what I think about it. But again, we have a long way to go on this rulemaking process. Mr. Sawchell, please go ahead. And then I think we'll move on.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I want to respond to Dietrich's question around WEC, since I have worked at WEC before, so I come with a little bit of experience in that matter. The most recent WESTEC effort that is underway has identified over 180 projects of transmission build-out that were not reflected in the WEC anchor dataset. For those who don't know the WEC anchor dataset, I'll elaborate on it when I touch on my presentation. But Dietrich, there's a very significant value add in CETA playing a verifier role, because you only have the perspective and the vision and the situational awareness of your footprint of one utility. WEC does not have a verifier or validating the transmission plan proposals or projects. If we allow CETA to have a role to do a study, they should be able to then have the data that comes from WEC and host it and have a one-stop shop to review the assumptions on the topology that is technically not currently done. That's my quick answer to your question. And I'll stop there, Dan, because I want to focus on when I come to my stuff. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And actually, that's a good segue. But I realize we can't move on, and I want to pass back to Maury Galbraith and the others from CETA in case you have additional comments before we're not moving off of you entirely, but I do have some one or two other additional questions. But please go ahead if there's anything additional you want to say.
No, Dan, we just want to thank you and thank the participants that have reached out to us to explore some of these options. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about CETA and explore different roles going forward. So thank you. And we'll be on the call. We're not going anywhere. We'll be able to respond later if needed.
All right, great. Thank you. Well, then I'll move on to my next slide, which is really the question about data. And I just wanted to ask about your experience in getting the data that you needed to do your initial needs assessment study, and whether there are any rules that might be needed. And this need not, this is not a question necessarily just for CETA, so others may want to opine on this, but are there any rules needed to ensure that you get the data that you need to do quality, accurate modeling?
So I will summarize the experience that we've had for transmission study. We hired Energy Strategies, a consulting firm out of Salt Lake City, to conduct the modeling and do the study for us. They obtained data primarily from WEC. Vijay mentioned the anchor data set and some of the base cases that they do for future years. And so that was a primary input into our plan. And then we also acquired some data to do resource capacity expansion. We used the Resolve model, and some of the data for that we acquired from the Colorado Energy Office that had used that model in a previous planning effort. And I think we received input throughout the study development process from the incumbent utilities. And I think that the planners at Energy Strategies reached out and asked clarifying questions to several of the utilities and got responses that way. So I'd say that overall the experience obtaining data was positive. Could there be improvements? I'm sure that undoubtedly there are potential improvements. I think some of the issues and concerns with the anchor data set have been known for quite some time, all the way back to the point in time where where that concept was first created. I was in some of those initial meetings when we were talking about the creation of the anchor data set. So some of those, there's some long-standing challenges with the anchor data set. So could there be improvements? Undoubtedly, but we did not have any significant barriers to obtaining data in conducting our 2024 study.
Well, that's good to hear. And I don't think there's anything that Colorado PUC can do about WEC anchor database. But maybe somebody else has an idea. So if so, please speak up. Anyone else want to chime in on this particular subject? I'm not seeing any hands up, so I think I will move along. And we've already talked about this a bit. Is there value in requiring the utilities? Well, this is phrased a little differently. Is there value in requiring utilities to have their transmission plans and stakeholder alternatives modeled on the CETA platform? I think this would fall closer to the independent transmission monitor role. So I do want to put this question out there, and I think we may have some input possibly from the utilities on this question. I mean, that would be great if we got some input from the utilities on this. What would be the advantages and disadvantages of asking CETA to model the utility plans on its common platform, common statewide platform? And then I guess, Maury, I think we've talked about this a little in the past, but if you can provide any insight into how long it might take for CETA to do that and what it might cost. Maybe I'm putting you on the spot, so you may not have that information readily at hand. But these are things that I worry about, and I wonder about, I should say. And I think it would be useful to start a conversation about that. So I guess first I'll just put out an appeal to any of the utility folks that are participating today. What are your thoughts about having your transmission plans modeled on the CETA platform? All right, I got no takers on that question. Thought it might be kind of controversial, but now I get some hands going up. Great, Mr. Hefner, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just have a question on this one, and it's a basic question, which is I'm not sure we know what the CETA platform is or what that means.
Okay, so what I'm thinking of is the platform that they developed with the WIC anchor data set and the ERP plans, the data on capacity expansion that Mr. Galbraith was just talking about. So basically the platform they developed to develop the transmission needs study.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's helpful. Again, I think we're looking for sort of if it's based on the same WEC data and utility data that the utilities are already using to do their modeling, sort of what's the incremental value. And I know I have some tri-state transmission planning colleagues on the phone who may want to chime in with a more detailed version of that question. But I think our sort of high level concern remains the same, which is how do you essentially take all of the same inputs and add value with a sort of a different model? What's the incremental benefit?
All right, Mr. Satchel, please go ahead.
Dietrich's making my life very easy, so I'm going to respond to Dietrich's question very directly. the anchor data set and the base case is submitted and modeled by TPL studies. And Dietrich, your transmission planning team is on the call, so they should hopefully clarify or confirm or correct me. Is it looks at the 10-year out or 5-year out. There is a 5-year base case, there's a 10-year base case, and they're only looking at the most likely to be built transmission. That is very different than what you submit that will be associated with an ERP. That is very different than what will be submitted if FERC Order 1920 compliance is to happen. So in those matters, it makes a lot of sense for, and I agree, I don't know what the CETA platform means, but I do agree in the role for CETA to model all the utility transmission plans or bring those projections into one big blanket and look at the state level impacts and implications, which WEC does not do. To clarify something for everybody on this call, WEC does not do planning. WEC does assessment of reliability impacts based on the base cases. So what Maury is being empowered, hopefully, by us in future for CETA to do is a plan that evaluates scenarios of implications of project build out based on extreme weather events, based on climate change issues, based on economic conditions, based on load growth, everything for the entire state. That's how I look at this. That's why I support a plan like this to be filed by CETA to be done every 2-3 years prior to the ERP filing that can inform the ERP process. Thank you.
Thank you. Since both Mr. Huffner and Mr. Satyal were unclear about what the CETA platform might be, I guess I will ask Maury, do you know what I'm talking about? I mean, does CETA, my best of my understanding, CETA developed a platform to do the transmission needs study. So perhaps, Maury, you can set me straight or describe, am I using the wrong word? To me, that's a modeling platform.
Yeah, Dan, when I hear you say, CETA platform, I think about the models and the data sets that Energy Strategies use to conduct the 2024 transmission study. So I think of the power flow base cases that they use to conduct that analysis. I think about the inputs to the production cost model that they use to identify congestion. So that's the platform. It's a set of data sets and a set of modeling tools that are current as of today. And then as we get further and further down the road, those databases become more and more stale and need to be updated. That's partly why CETA is interested in periodically reconducting the transmission study. And so the platform would sort of change over time. And the way I think about what you're asking for here is you're asking CETA to take its most recent set of models and its most recent sets of data and try and model the utilities plans using those tools and those databases and opine on any alignment or discontinuities between the two. And so that's what I hear when I hear CETA platform. I think of the databases and the tools that we use, and it would be an update of our most recent plan or a study that is a spinoff from our most recent plan. And in terms of dollars, it would be, the cost of doing one of those efforts would probably be less than the cost of the overall initial study. The tools and the models have been developed. And in terms of timing, again, I don't know. I'd have to go to the consultant and ask, one, if they're interested in doing this, and two, how quickly they could turn around a modified study. But that's what I think about, Dan.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that information.
Can I just interject? Is it true, Maury, that CETA does not own those tools? The consultants own the tools. Isn't that correct?
we don't have licenses to the models, right? But again, some of the models are open source. At least the generation capacity expansion model is open source. The power flow model and the production cost model are not. But the databases, I think, are available to CETA, and CETA can make those databases available to others as long as we're following appropriate disclosure agreements with WEC and others. So, Ken, I think it's a little bit of a mixed response.
Thank you. Mr. Farrell from RMI, please go ahead.
Great. Good afternoon. Tyler Farrell. I'm a senior associate at RMI. Thanks for the opportunity today. I think the way that I'm interpreting this question is probably similar to Maury, but I wanted to add one kind of piece to this, that I think it's really about CETA's process and the uniqueness that CETA's transmission planning process brings. And when I talk about process, it includes the data and modeling, but also includes the stakeholder engagement, the independence, the statewide view that Vijay and Maury both brought up. And then also the final thing, and I think the most important thing, is the cost-effective assessment of how does the state of Colorado meet the load growth needs, the reliability needs, the public policy needs, factoring in those four facts. And that's what I really think, to answer your question, what is the value, is that uniqueness of a different process that the utilities don't offer. And that's another kind of advantage of this process and platform, in your words, Dan, would be for this independent perspective for a role like an ITM or a verifier of utility transmission plans. That independence, that uniqueness kind of counteracts the utilities processes and provide a different view on how Colorado can meet its needs, which I think is extremely valuable. And is why we kind of play such a large role in the stakeholder process and really applaud Maury's work. That's all I have to say, and definitely kind of want to reiterate the focus on an ITM and like a verifier of utility transmission plan is a great role for CETA to play in the future.
Great, thank you very much for those comments, Mr. Farrell. All right, well, I not see any further hands up, so I think we will move along. And our next subject is this proposal for an MOU between CETA and the PUC. I understand since WRA, Western Resource Advocates, submitted its original comments a long time ago, their understanding and has evolved a little bit. Now they're thinking maybe the MOU might be better, might only be needed between the CETA and the PUC. It seemed like an interesting idea, and I wanted to give WRA an opportunity to flesh it out here. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Vijay Satyal, who we've heard from a bunch already. And Mr. Satyal is WRA's Deputy Director for Regional Markets. Mr. Satyal, take it away.
Thank you. We at WRA believe in decarbonization, as you all know by now, but we also believe that cannot be achieved without markets and competition and infrastructure expansion. And so the transmission angle is what I will touch upon. Next slide, please. Thank you, by the way, Dan, for running the slides. I don't need to belabor this much, but you have the slides and you will get it. But we work across 6 states, and our focus is definitely on data and evidence-based solutions. And that's why this partnership between 2 sister agencies will be valuable. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. There is the value add, since I keep hearing the value add kind of question from our good friend Dietrich or anybody else who may want to ask. The value add that I think CETA brings to the table is a true independent perspective across the geographical state of Colorado, not the investor-owned utilities footprint only, but the IOUs play a big role. The Tri-State plays a big role as it impacts the public power on their transmission needs. So who's going to point to whom for how much transmission is needed, or how much transmission congestion exists, or how much renewable curtailments are happening or not? Putting all of that emphasis on the PUC staff is not practical and realistic when CETA has been created to do the exact thing. But PUC is, after all, the approver, the official approver of transmission plans, the official rate recovery approver for IOUs. So WRA feels there should be an MOU created between PUC and CETA. Next slide, please. And this is not a surprise. This is not something new. We have been here before. Thanks to my colleague and our Colorado team lead, Parks Brosco, who's also the attorney for us, has highlighted and reminded me that we already have some consultation agreement between the Colorado PUC with the Air Quality Department. And Dan, you also referred to it earlier, but this was in our vision when I was looking for a collaboration here between these two entities. I come from Oregon, and there is an agreement between the Oregon Siting Agency and the Department of Energy with other sister agencies in Oregon. In California, we have an MOU between the California PUC, the Air Resource Board, and CEC on load growth and resource adequacy. So this is not new. This is not a scary thing we're proposing. We're proposing a very fundamental MOU that will officially involve that role of consultation and verifying of the transmission plans under Rule 3627A by CETA. Next slide, please. This MOU would be important and needed for a couple of reasons. But before we get into the why, what is this MOU? What should this MOU entail? It should include PUC rules that will be starting next year to specify an MOU that will encompass a periodic every 3-year review of transmission plans, sharing of transmission topology and related data. A WEC NDA is not difficult to get. Entities can sign and get it. It will help our IPP community. It will help the developers. It will help Platte River Power Authority, CSU, all other public power in Colorado. So have a one-stop place where transmission data is available. More importantly, CETA has the capability, and hopefully if it's empowered with more resources, to do an independent review of the transmission plans filed by the utilities, which is not there right now. We are not seeing how transmission expansion is being modeled by utility 1 versus utility 2 versus utility 3. There could be a common yardstick created that CETA can compare. And here I give the utilities some good news. WRA is not pushing for an independent transmission monitor. We are not sure CETA is ready to do that, but CETA can give advisory opinions and do the review of the transmission plans and submit it into the record that the PUC staff can review and look at and use in their judgment and their evaluation. There's another important reason for this MOU. We have the Connected West study that's come out, which identifies decarbonization goals by 2050 and where transmission is needed. How much of that transmission will come out of Colorado? How much of the transmission will connect into Colorado? We don't know. And that's not in the scope of PUC stuff. What happens with Order 1920, even if it gets repealed, states might be engaging in it. What if West Connect is undertaking a regional expansion evaluation? Unless you are in a very open stakeholder process, you don't see the benefit and value of what is being planned at West Connect. See, West Connect has recently made their meetings closed to debate how to respond to Order 1920. Not a single CETA meeting was closed door. So those are my value propositions. Sorry, my main components of the MOU that I propose from WRA. Next slide, please. So why do we need this? It would behoove you, if you are a developer or a utility, to not compare your options for transmission expansion by not comparing rate-based opportunities of financing versus a bond-based financing that Maury talked about. So why not look at the low-cost financing option as a comparison before you decide to invest in a 230 kV line or a 500 kV line over whether it's a 15-mile distance or a 200-mile distance? Why not have that alternatives prudency evaluation be a resource? That's what CETA brings to the table. I've already talked about independence, so I'm going to skip that. But the one important thing I'm going to bring up is CETA is in the statute. CETA has a role to play. CETA has been empowered. So why don't we enable and use that resource? An important area that I touched upon earlier, but I will expand on, is Maury highlighted that actually. Maury said that there's some interest from public power utilities, non-IOUs, to do an evaluation for them on their assessment. I don't know about you all, but I'll make this a little personal. I go twice a year for a full checkup. I'm getting old. So I have my doctor's appointment tomorrow for a full diagnostics checkup. Why not have CETA being doing that diagnostics checkup for all the utilities, that's jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional? CETA is not in the lobbying business, so we shouldn't worry about that. Another important area why CETA should have a big role to play in the Colorado PUC process. If Colorado utilities are to join an RTO or even a day-ahead market, which Dietrich has already indicated that Tri-State will join the SPP RTO West, you will have the situations where the transmission planning functions by the RTO or a day-ahead market will have their own transmission planning evaluation. How can we be sure that we are comfortable with that stakeholder process or those transmission planning metrics that is focused on a market-based? CETA would offer what is good in the state to be done, and that very evaluation of that proposals could be compared to. And lastly, if you have open source tools being used a lot, CETA can be a home for hosting the topology and assumptions data, tracking what's happening with West Connect, tracking what's happening with CPCG, keeping up with the West Tech effort, which is the latest West-wide transmission expansion collaborative that I'm on the committee of. And I feel that CETA could use more connectivity, no pun intended, into those regional efforts. Last slide, please. So bottom line is, I'm directing this slide more to the ratepayers, the consumer advocates on the call, I hope, and to CETA, to PUC staff, is you have a unique opportunity here for ratepayers to have a low-cost financing option at the same time. And it could be something that the utilities can go to the PUC, get 50% ratepayer support, do 50% public-private financing, or come here. Whatever business models exist, build, operate, own, build, operate, transfer, you have a basis for cost allocation work that also CETA can help assist with, which MWTG tried to do and then it failed for whatever the reasons be. I don't want to overthink that. We are in a new paradigm now. We are looking at west-wide regionalization of markets and transmission, having a transmission authority looking at what is best for Colorado is what WR is proposing in the form of this MOU that should be included in the rules. I think that is it from me. Next slide. I think that was it. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions from anyone.
Yes, we have some takers. Mr. Fidrick from Tri-State, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you, Jonathan from Tri-State. I did have one question about the last bullet point for the one-stop open source home to transmission topology and assumptions data, which we've kind of discussed, that already ties back to the anchor data set at WEC. And I guess the question I have is, how do you evaluate the assumptions within that data or control that from a state perspective when a lot of the information that's in there, some of it could be conceptual when you're talking about, like, I think it's the level 3 data specifically, and that's outside of the state, which does have a direct impact into really like when you go towards production cost modeling, it has an impact on some of the evaluations that you see or some of the congestion from that data set. Who, I guess at this point, who imposes what assumptions are valid or should be considered as part of that model? And also the same goes with the transmission topology. And then, I guess, what are the controls around that? I have a lot of questions, and I guess I'm not very clear on how this would be maintained versus from CETA, from their perspective.
Do you have
I can try to go first, and then Maury can correct or improve upon whatever I say. So what I meant with this bullet is, if CETA is to do their own study, it would have a one-stop place to source the data and keep it. Whatever is appropriate that is coming from WEC, you would still have to go through the WEC NDA and get that agreement, and then you can access the data. What I'm speaking to is the gap assessment that CETA did. If they were to do it again, which I hope they do in 2 years or so, that data, that assumptions, each utility has their own topology, they have their own assumptions, and that's separate. We're not questioning that. We're not questioning Tri-State's modeling its topology and doing their TPL studies for with mod 32 or 33. I'm focused on empowering CETA. If they were to do any gaps assessment in future, they'll be able to source that data and hold it there, and whatever agreements will need to be taken with WEC, that's one thing. But if CETA staff or CETA consultant does an evaluation of a future expansion of a 20-year scenario for the statewide, that's their prudential best guess technical assessment. That has nothing to do with contradicting or questioning Tri-State's expansion plans.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up. I guess that's not the road I was headed down. The road I was headed down was, how do you validate external to the state information that impacts the end result for the state itself? That's more of the road I was going down.
I'll think more and get back to you, but I'll get back here. But
okay,
more,
thank you.
So Jonathan, that validation function that you're talking about is critically important. If you're familiar with the WEC anchor data set, you know that WEC does not perform that validation function. If WEC looks at the data that is submitted to it by transmission operators and sees inconsistencies or inaccuracies or those kinds of data problems, they reach out to the utility that submitted the data and they ask the utility that submitted it to correct it or to respond. But they have no ability to, and they don't have an interest in making those kinds of corrections on their own. And so what you see is that there are a lot of internal inconsistencies, a lot of inaccuracies in the WEC anchor data set that later get discovered by people who are using that data set. People like Energy Strategies and E3 and consulting firms that use the anchor data set discover a lot of these errors or internal consistencies and correct them, but they ultimately don't get adopted by other entities. And so, it's a really good question about, who's doing the vetting and who's making sure that the data is high quality. And so, again, potentially in some, future world, CETA and its consultants could, offer, its corrections and its improvements on the anchor data set and make those available not only to stakeholders, but to utilities within Colorado, right? I mean, utilities in Colorado, if they're just simply grabbing the anchor data set, are potentially missing some of the corrections that are discovered by others. And so that vetting role is a really interesting question. There's a lot of details that would need to be discussed, but it's not a very well vetted product today because, quite frankly, not all the utilities are interested in submitting their best data to WEC.
Mr. Freeman, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Well, I don't want to jump ahead of anybody else with their hand up, but I'm glad to just quickly respond. Thank you very much for the WRA presentation and proposal. I think I can't speak for the board as a whole or Maury, but we generally understand and support the notion of better coordination. As a lawyer, I've worked on MOAs for many years. We would want it to have enough tangible elements to be worth the time expended. But I had to react to a phrase in your presentation about leveraging CETA staff and again hit the same drum again. You're looking at CETA staff and unfortunately, there was an issue raised by one of the commentators about outside consulting and would we bring extra consultants in for this and that. At this point, the things we're looking at and proposing that would be critical to the MOU or items that we don't have the bandwidth. I think it's fair to say with the current staffing to do well. So we're going to need to really look hard at that element of this whole process to make sure that we can fulfill the aspirations that are being implied here. If so, I think the board would support the proposal generally of an MOU if it really looked like it could advance the ball. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see. Okay, Mr. Neal, please go ahead.
I was going to say that I think it'd be great to have some expertise to evaluate transmission proposals like that's been suggested. I added up all the transmission that PSCO is currently proposing, and it's just over $4 billion. And the PUC really doesn't have the staff to evaluate that. But at the same time, I worry about the independence. I don't think CETA can propose transmission projects and perform an independent evaluation of transmission projects. They kind of need to decide which end of the spectrum they want to be on, and then we've got to figure out where we can get some independent evaluation of transmission. Thanks.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions on Mr. Satchel's proposal, but before I get to that, I just want to give CETA folks an opportunity to respond to what Mr. Neal just said, if you'd like to. Roger, you still have your hand up. Did you want to respond, or is that?
So Dan, I think Mr. Neal's raising a really important point. I think the CETA board would want to think through those issues and that question on their own. I mean, I at the end of our presentation, if you look at the conclusion section, look, we're interested in being a statewide transmission planner. We're interested in being a public lender for transmission projects. We're willing to consider other roles, but there's a lot of details that would need to be worked through before we would be able to take on those roles. And I think the independence question that Mr. Neal is raising is one that is an important question. I'm not saying it couldn't be overcome or resolved. It's just a really important question that would need to be addressed on both sides by the people at the PUC and by the people on the CETA board.
Thanks. Mr. Satchel, before I ask my question, I just wondered if there was anything you wanted to say about...
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think Chris Neal brings up a super important point, and I think, unfortunately, I have an answer to address that question in terms of a solution, which is why WRA feels that we should take an incremental step and focus CETA's role on being a statewide transmission planner, evaluating the options and bringing in the utilities plans and seeing what it means for the rest of the state. I don't feel getting into the monitoring role is helpful right now, because we have to first see how the utilities will join markets where there will be an independent market monitor that looks at transmission issues anyways. So to avoid duplication and to ensure there's focus, CETA should start baby steps and do transmission planning and exactly the 2-3 things that Maury spoke about. And hopefully they're empowered with more funding or resources that they need.
Great, thank you very much. So what I wanted to ask you about, something I got a little stuck on. Whoops, I'm going the wrong direction here, sorry.
It's okay.
Here we go. Here we go. I guess 2 things on this slide. I'm not quite sure how an MOU fits in with PUC rules. I'm not clear on how we would specify in rule that the commission and CETA would execute an MOU. Is that what you're suggesting, or is there some other?
No. So if you go back to one more slide where we gave the example right here, this is the exact language you have for Colorado's clean energy, emission requirements related limits to be evaluated and compared, cross-checked in terms of how the clean energy planning requirements exist with the ERPs and the plans that the utilities submit. So something like that is where you would have some language, and we can come up with some specific verbiage to give you in the rulemaking process. But the actual PUC rule will include that Colorado PUC will seek input and consult CETA that will do X, Y, Z. That is the point I'm proposing in the rules.
Okay, so exactly analogous to the CDPHE's rule.
Exactly. So that's why we picked this example and brought to all of you.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question was, you're specifying every 3 years here. Now, there's no reason to expect you to be an expert on our transmission planning rules, although I think you've probably been involved in some of those proceedings. So we asked the utilities to file 10-year plans on a 2-year basis. In fact, it's not just us that asked it. It's actually the legislature requires the utilities to provide these plans on a 2-year basis. So I just wanted to, it looks like this 3-year idea here is probably because we've talked about 3 years being the period of doing new needs assessments. But how would you respond to that?
So it can go either way. I know the utilities do it's a biennial transmission plan that they submit. My logic or thinking on the 3-year was, let's say, I don't know when the latest transmission plans are being filed, but let's say they are being filed next year in 2025.
So 26, but
okay, 26. Let's take 26. So Maury's team has already, CETA has already done the gap assessment, and they have proposed X number of transmission upgrades that are deserved to be invested in Colorado. That was this year. But let's say if 2026 is when the transmission plans will be filed by the utilities, in 25, CETA would come and do their periodic assessment, like a gap assessment, and look at what's the latest status of transmission expansion, what are the latest trending issues, and any federal or state policies that should be incorporated. And doing it in a way that is either 1 year before the biennial transmission plans come out or after. So that's why the 3-year thing, that would be 1 year before or after the utilities filing, so that utilities can benefit and learn from it. That was my simple logic. I didn't have a lot of science or brains matter on that, other than making sure it's off cycle to when the utilities submit their plans.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that clarification. Yeah, Mr. Turner, I see your hand up, and then I think we'll move on after Mr. Turner's comments. So please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Brian Turner from Advanced Energy United. Really appreciating this workshop. I think we're raising some very important roles that CETA could take on, especially around statewide planning and data consistency. And I think that the basic proposition that CETA should take on a statewide planning rule, and then that the utilities planning should be in alignment with that statewide planning, or explain why it is not, is a solid fundamental principle that any rulemaking should go forward with. I wanted to speak directly to the issue of data and the inputs and assumptions into transmission planning, and the importance that that be transparent and consistent across utilities, across time, that it evolve in a transparent and consistent manner for not only the quality of the planning overall, but also stakeholders' ability to participate and interrogate the assumptions and conclusions reached. So I just want to speak directly to the inputs and assumptions that should be a regular part of a CETA statewide transmission planning process on whatever cadence it is established, and that should provide a foundation for utility data inputs and assumptions. I understand that utilities may have valid reasons for maintaining their own data sets and modeling assumptions, and that can coexist with a consistent statewide platform, data, assumptions, et cetera. And we just need an explanation where the variances occur, so that it is not haphazard or ad hoc or unexplained variation, where a utility can put forward a plan that has very different conclusions than what a statewide plan looks like and just say, well, our assumptions are different. There should be a process by which that differing assumptions are articulated and explained and queried. So my own proposition would be that on whatever cadence you're establishing statewide planning, 2, 3, 4 year, that there be a stage in that in which inputs and assumptions into that model are presented, queried, alternatives discussed, and then a final decision made, and that provide the benchmark against which any utility data assumptions, et cetera, are presented.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it makes complete sense that if we're going to have any value out of any kind of a verification role for CETA, that the data, the inputs would need to be aligned between the utilities and CETA. Sounds like that has gone well so far. So I was glad to hear that. I'm not surprised, but sounds like that so far has not been an issue. But you know, as if significant time has elapsed between CETA's last study process and a utility filing, then there could be you know, divergence. There could be more opportunity for divergence between the data sets that the inputs to the models. All righty, let's see here. What's next? Statewide planning as utilities join organized wholesale markets. So here we're shifting gears a little bit to discuss a few questions that aren't specifically about CETA's role, but do concern statewide transmission planning. I'd personally like to better understand the nature of the challenges that could be posed by seams created by if and when utilities join multiple organized wholesale markets in Colorado. And I thought I would start by asking our utility participants to give their perspectives on this before turning these questions over to others. So any takers on the questions that I have up on the screen now? What are the planning challenges that seems create? How can optimal plans be developed if we ultimately have these seams within the state? And is there a precedent elsewhere where ISOs have collaborated to bridge seams? So I'm hoping we'll get a number of folks participating in that on this conversation. And yeah, Mr. Taylor from Public Service, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Dan. Joe Taylor with Public Service. A couple of thoughts, you know, on the first question, the planning challenges. I mean, the paradigm, once RTO West is formed, is obviously going to change how transmission planning is done in the state. Because I understand that SPP is going to become a new Order 1000 planning region, and it'll take over the planning role of, you know, many of the present day CCPG utilities. And I don't yet know at least how SPP plans to engage with CCPG. Another comment I think is, you know, at the same time, you could actually look at this paradigm and say, well, actually, this is going to reduce the planning seams that exist in the state because SPP is the RTO for many of the utilities in the state, would take over the primary planning authority for those utilities. So, you know, the seams are between fewer entities. And that's all I've got on that question. Thanks.
Well, thanks. I wonder if, Mr. Taylor, you or other utility folks could just humor me a little bit by, and I don't know if you've had this experience or not elsewhere, perhaps in Minnesota, but I don't think so. But I'm just trying to get a generic or a high level understanding of what are the problems that seams can pose in transmission planning. Is that something you can respond to?
You know, I'm actually more of the markets guy.
Okay, all right. Well, then I won't ask you to. But I will encourage anyone that does have insight into that question to please raise your hand. But thanks very much, Mr. Taylor, for your comments, and we'll move back to Vijay, who has his hand up, and please go ahead.
I'll respond to your first question and the third one. I'm not a modeler, so I can't speak to how they can be developed optimally. The planning challenges in terms of seams, even though Joe is very correct in that if PSCO is in a day-ahead market and Tri-State goes into RTO West, you have most of the Colorado utilities joining the SPP market. You'll have one BA and they'll have similar transmission planning rules or processes. The problem you still have is you still have a seams created with the Colorado utilities adjoining Pacific Corp with a gateway system, and you have seams in New Mexico created with SPS. So I have to admit with all genuine sincerity that seams is unavoidable. It's going to be the case, and you're going to have transmission planning related seams, and you'll have potentially seams created because of IPPs who may want to sell energy or dispatch in one market and another one right within Colorado, and that could be an example of seams being created. WRA is initiating an assessment of seams and mitigating practices that should be considered by both markets. That work will start in January with grid strategies, and we will hopefully have that available by May or June to share our findings. The example I would like to share is it's taken over 8 to 10 years for SPP to partner with MISO and have what's called an interoperable agreement. So seems is not trivial matter as much as it has taken a while for the utilities to agree that they will work on it. The good news is SPP does have a seams framework proposal with a committee that's ongoing. And my recommendation would be to invite the seams work group chair, Julie from Chelan PUD, to come and speak to this group if everybody would like an education on what are the seams issues they are working on right now. There's greenhouse gas accounting seams, there's going to be economic seams, and there's going to be reliability and transmission seams. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Mr. Turner, please go ahead.
Thank you. Brian Turner, Advanced Energy United. I actually perhaps need to ask a question before putting in a statement, or perhaps it's both. Regarding RTO West, I've heard that phrase used to refer to the western expansion of SPP's current RTO, but is still managed and optimized from Little Rock, Arkansas. And I've heard it used to describe a future Western RTO operated by SPP, but planned and optimized for just the West. And I believe that's a meaningful distinction, and I think it would have a lot of meaning for transmission planning. But because the term, as I've understood it, is used for both, it gets quite confusing. So I think it's important that to the extent there is a distinction there, that we maintain and understand that distinction. And I'll just segue into a statement based on my understanding that for the time being, for the foreseeable future, the Western expansion, what we're dealing with is the Western expansion of SPP's RTO, and that transmission planning then and optimization will occur by the current SPP organization. And I think in that case, the interests of Colorado stakeholders, Colorado ratepayers, policymakers, it may not be inappropriate to say deserves a Colorado-based advocacy from policymakers, from the PUC specifically, that can, from policymakers in general, including the PUC, that can have an evaluation of what Colorado's electricity grid systems needs are and advocate for that within SPP planning. if that's the road they're going down. So long story short, I think that CETA continuing to have a role in statewide planning that can be an input into whatever organized markets, RTOs may be responsible for that transmission planning would be appropriate. And it would bridge then who is in SPP's RTO and who is not in SPP's RTO. And I think I'll stop there and would welcome any clarification about that earlier point about what exactly is RTO West and what is transmission planning in its various forms.
Yeah, thanks. And well, great. I see your hand is up, Mr. Galbraith, and I was going to call on you. So please go ahead.
Well, so I think I heard that SPP would become a regional planning entity in the West, right? So they would be taking over some of the footprint that is probably currently in the West Connect footprint. And so I think the more important question is seams between regional planning entities and FERC's Order 1000 and Order 1920 interregional coordination process, right? So FERC does not require joint planning across the regional planning seams, right? They just require coordination. Whether or not you think that coordination is sufficient or not is up to you. But there's no guarantee that you're going to get sort of planning across those planning seams in the future. And so again, CETA can potentially fill that gap to ensure that Colorado is building the transmission that's needed to achieve its clean energy goals and assure reliability and affordability for customers. So that's the point I would make.
Mr. Turner raised the question, I think, of whether that's something CETA. I mean, I don't believe we talked about this earlier today. Mr. Galbraith, would CETA entertain contributing to the SPP processes, perhaps through I forget the name of the subcommittee, but the subcommittee that is set up for state input on SPP planning?
So all I can offer, Dan, is that I met with the planning team at SPP roughly a year ago to talk about whether or not they viewed Colorado utilities joining an SPP RTO as obviating the need for CETA, and at least based on those preliminary conversations, they welcomed CETA participating in their future transmission planning process and actually saw a role for a statewide planning entity to provide input into their regional planning process, right? So I'll just leave it there. And again, they weren't committing to anything. We weren't committing to anything. We were just exploring some of the questions that I think you've raised about what becomes of CETA after Colorado utilities join an RTO. And I don't think there's any easy, simple answers there. It's not that they're going to be planning transmission for the state of Colorado. They're going to be planning transmission for their regional footprint, which may be different than Colorado. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much. So Mr. Turner's question about kind of the terminology is still out there. What does the Western market, what does that mean? Does that mean SPP West that is planned for only on the west side of the interconnection, or is it a term that refers to a separate Western effort? Mr. Taylor, I see your hands up. I don't know if you were going to respond to that, but if you can, I think we'd appreciate it. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was hoping folks hadn't forgotten Brian's question. Yeah, Brian, it's a term RTO West is for people like me who've been involved in this for a while was the term. It's been rebranded as RTO expansion, but it is essentially it's the same thing in my mind. It's not expanding the SPP RTO throughout the Western footprint, at least not at this time. It's integrating the parties that are interested in joining the SPP RTO who happen to be west of the DC ties that separate the Western and Eastern interconnects.
Can I ask Joe, if you don't mind?
ahead.
So do you anticipate that transmission planning then is going to occur on like the regular cadence and integrated with the same plan that comes out of SPP when they do their processes that they currently do?
Yeah, that's my understanding. I mean, they're the I believe it's called the ITP, the Integrated Transmission Plan that SPP performs every couple of years, and once the RTO expansion members are members, then they would their systems would be incorporated into that plan.
Okay, and again, I don't mean to press you for info if you don't have this, but the governance then of that ITP would be basically the same. It would not go through like Markets Plus has its Markets Plus Executive Committee. I don't think that there's considering one for this RTO expansion. So it would go through the existing governance process at SPP.
Yeah, and I think, folks that are closer to joining the RTO may have a more specific answer, but the SPP RTO governance is going to go with the members. So the new members will have the same governance as the existing RTO.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Not seeing any more hands up to comment on these questions. So I think we'll move along to facilitating development of interregional.
Dan, could I add, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
I really focused on the first question, and I have a comment or two about the other ones.
Oh, great.
So, the PSCO, when Public Service, when we intervened in the RTO expansion tariff filing, we brought up the issues of seams, and we have been engaged, as have, I believe, every other major utility or transmission owner that the RTO expansion is going to touch, in developing what we'd call a joint operating agreement between ourselves and SPP. I just wanted to point out that those conversations have started, and we're moving along. And they address a number of things like planning and generator interconnection and utilization of existing transmission rights, especially on lines that are jointly owned by the utilities in Colorado and other places. And then as far as precedents, yeah, I know SPP has joint operating agreement with MISO. I think MISO and PJM have got JOAs. SPP has told us they've have JOAs with not only other RTOs, but with utilities that are inside of the kind of the RTO footprint, but aren't in the RTO. And that's kind of the examples we're using to approach a JOA between PSCO, Public Service, and SPP.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate that. Okay. So there's
Dan and Roger Freeman, just 10 seconds to say thanks so much for the dialogue. It's really useful to the board. We are definitely picking up on these issues as we go, along with the core issues we've talked about already. It all ties together. I probably won't have as many comments myself as we go along through the program, but we're listening and appreciate the dialogue very much and the engagement of all our stakeholders throughout the process since we were formulated.
Well, I'm very glad that it's useful. Thanks for saying that. And I just makes me think, we're likely, I only have one more set of questions. So I think, I originally planned this session to go until 5 o'clock. I think we'll likely be done before 4 o'clock, but I think just so everyone is aware, I think once we get through my last slide, I'm, open to keeping this meeting going. If folks have additional issues that they would like to raise that I haven't raised, I guess it could become a free-for-all, and I don't want it to go on forever. But I mean, we do have this time reserved, and we have a forum here and a bunch of interested stakeholders and participants, and I think might be useful to make use of that to the degree that folks have additional issues and want to stay on the line. So with that, why don't I move along to facilitating development of regional and interregional transmission assets. This is something we talked about. I think it was in the optimizing the existing grid workshop, but some questions that are kind of go on a different, take a different tack. And really, this is about how best to promote the development of these some regional, interregional transmission facilities that would be beneficial to ratepayers. I think probably everybody that's participating today has read probably multiple of these reports that have been done at regional and state, regional and national levels, demonstrating very significant operational capital reliability and resilience benefits of interregional lines, regional and interregional lines. So my questions here really boil down to what can the PUC do to best promote their construction? So I have 3 specific questions. First is, what responsibilities do jurisdictional utilities have to promote the analysis of potentially beneficial regional and interregional transmission assets at both CCPG and WestConnect? And I guess I heard earlier that WestConnect doesn't do any planning studies, so maybe that one is not even relevant. But I'd like to have a little bit of discussion about, do the utilities that we regulate, do they have a responsibility to promote the analysis of regional and interregional assets? I haven't seen a whole lot of evidence that this has been done in the past. So really my question is, what should we be is there anything that we should be holding our jurisdictional utilities' feet to the fire to look at these assets? So I'll give you a minute or two to ponder that one. Mr. Turner, looks like you have something to say. Please go ahead.
Well, sure. With that kind of invitation, how can I resist? Yes, in fact, they do have a responsibility. And I mean, this has been the subject of federal policymaking for a decade or two now, and recent activity because of the failure of Order 1000 to do anything effective. We've got Order 1920 now to reinvigorate that process. And I think that it's very appropriate for us to be discussing it in the context of CETA, because we have an invitation out of the federal policy making out of the 1920 order to have a state engagement process. We need a body in Colorado that can be the state engagement body. CETA might be the appropriate place for that. And I think that specific proposition should be put on the table. I will note that CCPG does not have a statutory role. It is not mentioned, as far as I'm aware, anywhere in Colorado statute, whereas CETA is. And so, CCPG, I'm sure, has an important role to play going forward. But as we've discussed, CETA really is a better situated, and perhaps because of that statutory authority, more appropriate place for that statewide coordination to go on. And if you've got a statewide coordination, then it should be doing that kind of interregional coordination. So I'll just mention that I'm really just citing to we do have the responsibility. There is an invitation for state engagement. CETA is well situated to be that state engagement place under the terms of FERC's 1920 order, and more broadly.
Thanks very much. So let me just follow up on that. So I think what you're saying is that CETA is well situated to play a specific role that's identified in FERC Order 1920. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's one of the things I was saying. There's the state engagement under 1920, where the planning region needs to go to the states. The state is engaged in both, especially around cost allocation. But I think that there's broader roles for the state in reviewing how the transmission planning process occurs.
But if I'm not mistaken, I mean, it's the requirement is on like West Connect and Northern Grid to do that, right?
The requirement is on West Connect to have this engagement with the state.
Okay, but CETA might participate in that, or perhaps
West Connect has to engage with the state, and the state can be many different entities.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and I think that the terminology in the rule is something like relevant state entities, something like that. Okay, next up is, thanks very much for that, Mr. Neal, please go ahead.
I was going to disagree with that. CCPG hasn't done these kind of studies. CPG has. They have a report on studies to make lines to the east, and they didn't go very far because their rough estimate of the cost of a DC inverter station was $1 billion. And you throw $1 billion on top of a transmission line, it doesn't get very economic. And especially when we've got plenty of sun and wind in Colorado, we don't need to go to Kansas or Oklahoma to get sun and wind. As far as the study to go to PacifiCorp, CCPG also did that study, and PacifiCorp was involved in looking at it. And we talked about it a lot. And then I asked, okay, who's going to own this line? And there was a big thud. Neither Piesco or PacifiCorp wanted to own that line and build that line. It just didn't seem to make sense to them. So the study has been done. The PacifiCorp line was found to be economic in one of Piesco's studies, but it was mostly because they reduced the amount of reserve margin public service would need, and that may or may not happen if you don't do it the right timing. So the studies have been done. They could be done again by CCPG. There's no problem with that, but they haven't found economic lines that people wanted to build and own.
Mr. Neal, would you think that if CETA is CETA is doing statewide analysis of needs and has identified in their first study many opportunities for at least regional interconnections, aside from the cost of DC converter units, would you agree that that kind of identification of specific potential within Colorado and connecting outside of Colorado will put pressure on the utilities? Well, at least identify opportunities for utilities to build regional or potentially interregional lines in the future.
Yes, it could present opportunities for utilities, and I think some of the regional, interregional lines are some of the ones that could be the best for CETA, because utilities aren't responsible for interregional lines, whereas those could be exactly the kind of thing that CETA could contribute.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. Yes, Ms. Tormone-Hickey, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dan. Lisa Hickey, representing the Interwest Energy Alliance again. We agree that utilities do have the responsibility to promote this analysis, and it's part and parcel of their duty to provide greenhouse gas reductions, low-cost utility service, and to prepare for interconnection into markets which they're required to join by 2030. All of that has been proven by numerous studies, at least around the West, to be best facilitated through regional and interregional transmission, which virtually pays for itself because of the benefits it often brings. That said, utilities in Colorado will probably continue to have difficulty doing that analysis well together, since they, by definition, have to share this data and the analysis of benefits, and it includes extra border outside of Colorado analysis potentially as well. Therefore, CETA, we agree, would be well positioned to help make that happen. Not only the analysis on a regional and interregional basis, as well as making the projects happen through its low cost bonding. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mr. Sawchell, please go ahead.
Thank you, Vijay Satyal, WRA. I will not repeat what my colleagues have already said, but in ways that can expand on what Brian Turner and Lisa Hickey have said. There's a fundamental fiduciary duty of the utilities to be able to evaluate transmission expansion, but they are often limited by their footprint, and that's what they focus on for the energy that they can connect into the system, which is why CCPG and WestConnect have a bigger role to play, and with Order 1920. However, CCPG is still a collaborative community of only TOUs, transmission owning utilities and planners. They don't have a formal stakeholder process like Colorado PUC has for your workshops. They don't have a stakeholder process like CETA has that they have done. So that is another reason why CETA should be given the valuable role to play, in which they can do the coordination and connection with CCPG and WestConnect and identify those plans that they propose or they approve and roll it into a statewide look. So that's we've said this before, but I think it's to be very clear that the cost benefit ratios that are used in the CCPG and WestConnect are based on cost benefit information that the utilities have on their system with their private sources of data. That's the transparency that lacks, that CETA could bring to the table with doing more interregional planning, because technically Colorado is going to turn into an island once they join SPP Markets Plus. So identifying potential westward facing resources that could be better harnessed with more transmission, it wouldn't hurt to have that evaluated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Van Gundy, please go ahead.
Yeah, so just want to get on here and clarify there was a WestConnect does run studies. They are on a biannual process. Pretty much the first year is the regional need study, and then the second year they run scenario studies of varying levels. So just wanted to clarify there was that brought up. And then to answer this question, jurisdictional utilities have the FERC Order 1000 and the FERC Order 1920A for their regional and interregional transmission.
So that requires them to work with their regional, like WestConnect, to develop. Does that require them to? I'm sorry, a little foggy on this. Does 1920 require them to conduct region-wide plans, or to participate in? I guess it requires them to participate in region-wide plans. Is that correct?
I believe that's right. I'm still trying to get that one myself.
All right, very well. Thank you. I appreciate the comments. Who's next? Mr. Hefner, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. We were just briefly going to agree with Mr. Neal's comments about the cost of some of these projects, and I think we've seen a similar thing, that there aren't necessarily folks lining up to own these very expensive interregional projects. And then second, just a minor correction on CCPG. There is an extensive stakeholder process that's detailed both on the CCPG website, as well as I think in Appendix J to the annual 3627 transmission filings. But that's a group that actively solicits stakeholder input, considers it, and has even taken on projects suggested by stakeholders. So just want to get that clarified for the record.
Okay, great. I appreciate it. Yeah, Mr. Galbraith, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to confirm the fact that West Connect still does transmission planning. They are in charge of regional planning for their footprint. And I'd like to also point out that in over 10 years of doing that regional planning, they've never identified one single regional need. It's all been identified as local. The local need solves any regional problems. And so, you know, FERC has concerns about that. They've raised those in Order 1920. So I'll just point that out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, my second question along these lines is, what legal responsibility does the commission have to require the jurisdictional utilities to analyze, to, you know, building or contributing to regional or interregional assets? And by legal responsibility, really what I'm thinking about here is the requirement that the commission provide for just and reasonable rates. So see if that triggers any thoughts on anybody's part. And, you know, a third question along similar lines is, instead of legal responsibility, what actually is our authority to require jurisdictional utilities to build or contribute to those assets, and where is the line between PUC and FERC authority? So if anyone has any wisdom to contribute or thoughts to contribute on either of those questions, I'd appreciate hearing from you. Yeah, Mr. Satchel, please go ahead.
I'm not a lawyer, but I will speak to common sense public policy that I know in this area. I don't know why the differentiation of responsibility from authority, but technically it's the commission's fiduciary duty to make sure that rates are just and reasonable. And as part of that, if there are transmission connectivity benefits that can expand utilities' access to low-cost energy and have long-term investment benefits that pay off in the long run, that automatically becomes a responsibility to not ignore transmission options. In other words, every time an ERP is filed, there should be a comparison of transmission options as well, which was part of your workshop you had like 2-3 weeks ago. So that is the responsibility that the commission should have, is in making sure that the utilities have done their evaluation of transmission expansion possibilities. In terms of authority, I mean, we got Dietrich and others on the call who are very knowledgeable on, and Lisa's there, but my understanding is that the PUC authority stays at the state level. If it's interregional and goes interstate transmission, then FERC would automatically get involved. So FERC role and FERC review. So that's my understanding on item 3, but I'm focused mainly on item 2 and the fact that why not have the utilities present that we have done an evaluation of transmission projects. For example, pick up the CETA study that just came out and include that in part of their review for future resource planning options. Thank you.
But let me follow up with you just a sec. You know, if we have a responsibility but no authority, you know, if the authority resides with FERC, how do we exercise the responsibility to require utilities to?
So this is not new. We've had multi-state transmission lines being built. The Boardman-Hemingway project is an example of 2 states having their own independent IRP processes where the need for the transmission was evaluated and given the thumbs up. And then Oregon PUC and Idaho PUC approved the line, which has 2 or 3 co-investors in the project. So if there is a transmission line being proposed from Colorado to go to New Mexico, the 2 respective authorities of the agencies will do their review and approve it. And then, of course, they will also submit an application to FERC for FERC tariff if needed. Basically, existing state authority of each commission will be invoked and leveraged or used.
Okay, so I mean, you gave an example of a case where two different states approved a proposed project, and I'm asking a little bit different question, which is because I'm not, in my short tenure with the commission and what I've read of previous transmission dockets, I'm not aware of cases that have been brought to the commission for a CPCN to approve a CPCN for a state that, I'm sorry, for an asset that or a line that crosses state boundaries.
Because the utilities have chosen to self-build their own transmission projects within the state, and they have not had the opportunity or the need or the motivation or whatever it be, financial reasons, to justify an interstate transmission line. But what if we had an IPP, independent merchant transmission developer, wanting to partner with PSCo or Tri-State and explore a transmission asset that will go across two states? Then the authority automatically comes on the commission to ensure they do the review for cost recovery and the prudency and the need that would be needed. It's just that you've not had that happen in Colorado, which is why maybe this question has come to you've posed this question.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Turner, please go ahead.
I just wanted to point to SB 72. That in its very beginnings expands the definition of the authority of the commission in approving CPCNs, specifically talks about lines that are interstate. Well, more specifically, lines that help in participation for organized wholesale market. So that's one of the criteria under a CPCN, and then also to help it meet RPS and emission reduction goals through participation in regional wholesale markets. So just one instance where that authority and responsibility has been expanded in recent legislation.
Okay, thank you. I will have to refresh on that one. I have to admit that I'm not familiar with that yet, but
and one other point is I was just reviewing that again, and for the purposes of talking about that, under the CETA section, it also mentions engaging through an RTO in helping the state plan transmission. So referring to an earlier question, I think that's provision N of the long list of authorities granted to CETA.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Wilson, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I have been told by very, very knowledgeable attorneys that no regulatory body in the U.S. has the ability to require new transmission. FERC and state PUCs approve or reject proposals to build transmission, but none of them have the authority to require it. Now, they can require transmission planning and lots of other things, but I think that's one of the problems of our whole system of managing the electric grid in the U.S., that no one has that ability. As far as multi-state in the West, I mean, if I were a utility, it would seem like a very uphill mission to work with another utility in another state. Then both of you go to your utility commissions to get approval for an interstate line. That it's without a market and an RTO, it's just probably very daunting to them. And on top of that, the fact that the West generally has very good statewide, or each state has good renewable energy, that there is less need to go state to state just to meet an RPS or a carbon commitment. Although I certainly think we should do that for reliability, but that's a different battle and a difficult fact to prove. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, so I think you're suggesting that it hasn't happened very much because we're RPS, well, because each state has maybe sufficient renewable resources to meet the regulatory requirements. Well, it may be the case. Maybe it's better to have long lines that cross state lines so you can access complementary resources, or to, as they say, make the grid bigger than the weather. Ms. Hickey, please go ahead.
Thank you. I really appreciate the question being asked because it does get to why it hasn't happened as much in the past. I agree with the others who have said that the legal responsibility comes back to, well, your question states, it assumes that the assets would provide net benefits to ratepayers. And so assuming that is proven by analysis, which the commission could require in its resource planning processes, which we do require transmission plans to be incorporated, touched on therein. So once that analysis is part of the resource plan, the commission can find that just and reasonable rates aren't provided because that transmission plan has been proven to be part of the most overall cost-effective portfolio. The reason it hasn't happened in the past is because other states don't have that built into their resource planning, even to the extent Colorado has, which has been, we've only begun to develop that in implementation, I think, in the past round or two. But also because cost allocation is not defined between states for regional or for regional lines between utilities. And of course, cost allocation is within the state's authority for retail rates and federal authority for wholesale rates. But it's the cost allocation, I think, that has prevented it in the end. But as Brian points out, the SB 72 states that the policy is part of the commission's analysis in a CPCN, which is brought to it, and as part of CETA. So going back to CETA's role, that's partly, I think, why CETA was formed, both to to bridge that gap between utilities, both for cost allocation analysis and considering the benefits, but also to inspire them by potentially taking on that role if utilities aren't able to work together to do so. So I think Colorado has reached the state where it has both the responsibility and the authority to require that transmission planning and to bring a CPCN in the event it's proven to be cost effective for ratepayers as part of a resource plan.
Thanks very much. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been gathering from various comments this afternoon, that CETA's role here can really perhaps facilitate utility interest, awareness, and interest, and that CETA, along with I think FERC 1920, can help to solve the cost allocation issue. Okay, thanks very much. I appreciate that. Yeah, Ms. Maury, please go ahead.
Yeah, Dan, I think the answer here is pretty straightforward, right? The states haven't got into requiring interregional transmission planning because they think FERC has it covered, right? It's FERC's jurisdiction. They think FERC Order 1000 has it covered, right? But after a decade of none of the regional planning entities in the West identifying a single regional need or interregional, or conduct a single interregional study, FERC issues 1920. They think the problem is that you're not looking far enough down the highway. that you're running on low beams and you don't have your high beams on and you're not looking 20 years out. Maybe they're right, and maybe going forward we see more regional needs being identified, more interregional planning occurring. But I'm not convinced. Let's put it that way. I'm not sure it really is just as simple as turning on the high beams and you're going to find more regional projects and you're going to find more interregional projects. I think there's some incentive issues that are out of alignment.
A helpful and seasoned, should we say jaded perspective? Mr. Vijay, please go ahead.
Thank you. I want to expand on something in a way, not to necessarily just rebut, but our colleague from PSCO highlighted that WestConnect does do a study and a plan. My question to WestConnect then, through our utility representatives here, would be, why did the first planning committee meeting become closed door on Order 1920 implementation? If you truly wish to explore interregional or even regional evaluation of transmission and look at compliance with FERC Order 1920, this should be the most public meeting possible and get feedback. So that's a question that I would like to pose to them. But I also want to highlight that our colleagues from RMI, Northwest Energy Coalition, Renewable Northwest, Interwest, had sent a letter requesting for more greater clarity around state engagement in terms of these stakeholders. So I want to combine two things here. One, what Brian Turner suggested is very appropriate, is leverage and empower CETA to be that relevant state entity. If the CPUC feels it will not be in their jurisdiction to do Order 1920 evaluation, and therefore the MOU again becomes important. But second is to request through this workshops to invite WestConnect to a future presentation or update on what they're doing with Order 1920A. Thank you.
I'm sorry, did you say 1920? You meant 1920, right?
Yeah, I meant 1920. They have an amendment. It's called 1920-A. That's what it's an amendment, but it's basically the same 1920 order.
And you're suggesting that we, as part of this process, or perhaps as part of the rulemaking, do a workshop.
Absolutely. Well, why not have WestConnect come and present to this forum and speak to what their role is and what they plan to do, because that will address your questions 2 and 3. Actually, all 3.
I like that idea. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And do we have anyone? I don't, Mr. Taylor, are you still, if you're still with us, do you have any, do you want to take up Vijay's question about the first planning meeting on coordination regarding FERC 1920 or 1920A? Or anyone else from public service that may want to comment on that? All right, I'm not seeing any more hands up. Mr. Lair, I did see your hand go up, so please go ahead.
Yeah. I apologize, Dan, for taking you through one more bright idea, but here it is. You know, if you look at the map of the transmission ownership around the West, two things I think you can gather from it. One is that there's a lot of joint ownership. Utilities have cooperated to build most of the longer lines, particularly that make us have a grid in the West. That's been historical fact. I think it's pretty obvious. And a key player in that, which I don't think has been mentioned in all the workshops that I've attended here, is the Western Area Power Administration. They are a joint owner in a lot of long lines in the West, and very important in that. Now, their administrator, Tracy LeBeau, spoke to a CREPSI meeting that was held here in Denver summer of 23, and mentioned that they have low-cost financing available through them. And it was very curious to me that she had to reach back about 15 years to get an example of Western's creative use of that. She referenced their activities, which were very beneficial on Path 15 in California. Some of you may remember that. But that money, I think, is still available. It's low-cost federal financing through Western for transmission. And so if we're going to consider how financing this stuff plays a part in planning for it, then it would be good to reference federal sources, because we do have various aspects of the IRA that pay for transmission. And as Tri-State will tell you, federal sources of funding can be very important at various times in the utilities life cycle. But if you take West 6th Avenue out of downtown Denver and take a left at Union, you'll come across the headquarters for Western Area Power Administration. And they have a bundle of money, which in my opinion, as a taxpayer, they ought to be using effectively to move up the dates and meet the higher aspirations we have for transmission. And we don't mention them, we don't talk about them, we don't think about them. So for your rulemaking writing assignment from me, Dan, would be to reference all sources of funding, to compare CETA's funding with utility funding, as well as include all other sources of low-cost funding, which would implicate this TIPS program at Western, as well as possibly the IRA funding that may or may not be available to us as we go forward. But certainly the TIPS program and Western's role should be on our minds, and we ought to find creative ways to intrigue them into bringing some of that low-cost funding to Colorado's transmission. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Did you say TIPS program? Is that TIPS?
TIPS, yeah. I'm transmission infrastructure something. I disremember what the acronym stands for.
Would you be willing to send me a link or two about that?
Yeah, I could probably go on the internet and find you something. I'll try to do that.
Okay, and you're making me realize, that's a hole in the invitation list to these workshops.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a hole in our thinking, Dan. We don't think of Western, and here they are right here in Lakewood. They're just kind of invisible. Certainly the folks at Tri-State know them and have a lot of sway with what they do, and can maybe be good ambassadors for us to bring some of that Western endeavor to bear on Colorado's issues.
Well, great, really appreciate it. And folks, that's an example of Ron took me up on my Ron Lear took me up on my suggestion to bring up other issues, and we have, I think, exhausted the conversation on these particular questions. So I'm just going to go to my thank you slide, and just kind of open the mic for it. We're a little bit before 4, so pretty much what I thought would happen today. And we have 32 folks still in this meeting, and I'll just kind of throw it open at this point. If you've got issues that are relevant to statewide transmission planning, CETA's role, perhaps we could go a little bit outside of that, but this is an opportunity to raise those and have your ideas, your questions knocked around by the brain trust that is currently present. So, Mr. Satchel, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate, because the Colorado regulated utilities have done a good job with expanding and building, investing in new transmission that they were able to rate base. The future is going to be interregional, and interregional connectivity should be ideally a component or a section in the future transmission plans. So we propose that be part of the rulemaking conversation. I also wonder if there should be feedback solicited from the utilities on cost allocation. What are their cost allocation needs? What are their challenges? One of the big hurdles to interregional transmission planning is what I like to call, it's called the triple hurdle problem. If you have West Connect, which has one set of cost benefit metrics, and say you have Northern Grid that has its own, so getting those aligned or satisfied to have a positive benefit cost ratio when they are based on different foundations can be a big issue. So it'd be good to consider cost allocation as a complete separate section in the rules conversation in light of interregional and solicit feedback from the utilities. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just want to make sure I'm following you, Vijay. You're saying, yeah, different metric, and
I'm saying what I was giving an example of the problem, but my point being, what are the appropriate cost benefit allocation metrics and the methodology that the utilities typically use or would want to use if we had to consider interregional transmission project? That'd be good to know about.
okay, and you may know this. Am I correct? I believe I read that 1920A got rid of some of the benefit categories that were required in this analysis. Is that accurate?
If I'm correct, and anybody can correct me, I think the factors were removed, but the benefits and the scenarios still exist. And the 20-year with a reasonable number of 3 scenarios should still be considered. But anybody else who's on top of 1920A can correct me, please.
Okay, because I think you're saying that that the metrics or the benefit. I think what you're saying, the benefit analysis differs from one region to another, and so
and that's why 1920A should help remediate that issue, because asking for scenarios to be modeled on a 20-year time frame and at least maybe 2 to 3. They wanted to make it more reasonable scenarios, but the state entities have a role to play in providing input or feedback on cost allocation, and if the regional planning groups don't come up with one. So again, it'll be good to hear from the utilities, if possible, on the workshop on what are their thoughts on Order 1920A.
Okay, thank you. I've taken notes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure. Mr. Farrell, please go ahead.
Thanks. Tyler Farrell again at RMI. Sorry. I think one thing I would like to bring out and kind of follow on Vijay here is I totally agree that regional and interregional planning is the future of the West, and that is clear through Order 1920 and what is required by utilities across the West by FERC. And it's also clear by the utilities and others Western decision makers' efforts with West Tech to develop a West-wide transmission plan. What's not clear to me, though, is how those plans, whether they're Order 1920 or West Tech, and sorry, one thing to just clarify here, West Tech is the Western Transmission Expansion Coalition that's put together by Western Power Pool. What's not clear to me, though, is with these plans, how will they be incorporated into Colorado's transmission planning? Because my understanding right now is that there's no kind of connection between the ERP process and these regional planning processes today. So I would love to see some language around how a line that is identified in these regional plans ends up in whether it's the ERP process or the Rural 3627 planning process. There needs to be a direct connection so these lines get planned and don't just sit on a shelf as paper, but actually get built and incorporated into Colorado's planning. That's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, very, very important. I agree. And that's what I think, we're going to be, I think that will be a focus as the rulemaking moves forward. How to ensure that utility transmission plans are aligned with the state and with the regional plans that you mentioned. All right, I'm not seeing any further hands up, and thank you very much, Mr. Farrell, for those comments. I'm not seeing any further hands up. I'll just give it a few more seconds here if somebody wants to raise another issue. But not seeing any. I'll just say this has been a very helpful. This series of workshops have been very helpful to me. I think it will be helpful to the commission as we move forward in the rulemaking, and I do hope that it has been helpful to you as the participants. Really want to thank everyone who has participated and those that have contributed to the discussion in particular, and look forward to further dialogue as we move forward. Again, as it says here, you've been looking after the last 5 minutes. If you care to submit comments into this docket regarding issues that we've discussed in these workshops, you are more than welcome. And I would hope to get those comments by December 13th. I should have had that on here, but December 13th is the date by which I would like to have comments regarding issues raised in the workshops. So, and with that, I think we'll adjourn. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.